What if I told you that there exists a version of the Bible that contains 81 books instead of the 66 you're familiar with? A Bible so controversial, so filled with revelations that challenge everything we've been taught, that it was systematically excluded from Western Christianity. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented history. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible stands as the most complete biblical canon in existence. While Protestant Bibles contain 66 books, and Catholic Bibles include 73, the Ethiopian canon preserves 81 books that paint a dramatically different picture of spiritual reality. But here's what researchers have discovered. It's not just about numbers. According to Dr. James Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary, the Ethiopian Bible contains texts that were deliberately removed from other Christian traditions during the early centuries of church formation. These aren't minor additions. These are foundational texts that fundamentally alter our understanding of creation, angels, prophecy, and humanity's true history. The most significant of these, the Book of Enoch. This ancient text, quoted directly in the New Testament Book of Jude, was systematically excluded from every other biblical canon. Yet the Ethiopian Church has preserved it as sacred scripture for over 700 years, considering it as authoritative as Genesis or the Gospels. What makes this even more compelling is Ethiopia's unique position in Christian history. According to preserved traditions, Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 1st century through the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts chapter 8. This means Ethiopian Christianity developed independently from Roman influence during the critical period when the biblical canon was being formed in the West. While Rome was deciding which books to include and which to suppress, the Ethiopian Church maintained its original collection, isolated by geography and protected by mountains that served as natural barriers against outside influence. Archaeological evidence supports this isolation. The ancient monasteries of Ethiopia, some perched on cliffs accessible only by rope, have preserved manuscripts dating back to the 4th and 5th centuries. These aren't copies of copies. According to manuscript specialists, some represent textual traditions that predate the standardized versions we use today. But perhaps the most disturbing question is this: why would texts considered sacred by the earliest Christians be systematically removed from Bibles used by billions of believers today? The answer lies in what these books reveal. And what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical history, angelic beings, and the true nature of spiritual reality. The Book of Enoch alone contains information so specific about the hierarchy of angels, the names of fallen beings, and the origins of forbidden knowledge that early church councils found it theologically dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was too revealing. When we examine the historical evidence, a pattern emerges. The texts that were excluded aren't random. They share common themes: direct spiritual knowledge without priestly mediation, detailed revelations about angelic rebellion, specific prophecies that proved remarkably accurate, and alternative chronologies that challenged official church narratives. The Ethiopian Bible preserved what others deliberately erased, and the evidence of this erasure isn't hidden. It's documented in the proceedings of church councils, in the writings of early church fathers who debated these texts, and in the manuscript traditions that show these books were once widely circulated before being suppressed. What you're about to discover isn't found in standard theology courses. These are truths preserved in one of the world's oldest continuous Christian traditions, truths that make certain religious authorities profoundly uncomfortable even today. Let's begin with the text that started it all. The Book of Enoch, the text they erased. The Book of Enoch is perhaps the most controversial text in religious history. And here's why. It doesn't just mention angels, it names them. It describes their rebellion in explicit detail. It reveals exactly what forbidden knowledge they taught humanity. And it does all of this with a specificity that made church authorities deeply uncomfortable. According to the text preserved in the Ethiopian canon, 200 angels descended to Mount Hermon and made a pact to take human wives. But this wasn't just about forbidden relationships. These angels, led by beings named Semjaza and Azazel, taught humanity knowledge that was meant to remain celestial. The Book of Enoch in chapters 7 and 8 provides a detailed account. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. This wasn't primitive mythology. This was a systematic transfer of advanced knowledge. And here's what makes this historically significant. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947. According to Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, these Aramaic fragments date to the 2nd century BCE, proving that Enoch was considered authoritative scripture by Jewish communities before Christianity even existed. The New Testament itself validates this text. The Book of Jude, verses 14 to 15, directly quotes Enoch's prophecy. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all. This isn't a casual reference. Jude explicitly names Enoch and treats his words as prophetic truth. So why was this book removed from every biblical canon except Ethiopia's? The answer becomes clear when we examine what the book reveals about the Nephilim, the offspring of these angel-human unions. According to Enoch chapters 6 to 7, these beings grew to enormous size and began consuming all the resources of humanity. When humans could no longer sustain them, the Nephilim turned to consuming humans themselves. This wasn't allegory. The text describes specific names, specific locations, specific events. It provides genealogies. It gives measurements. It reads like a historical document, not a metaphor. Dr. Michael Heiser, a biblical scholar who specialized in ancient Semitic languages, pointed out that the Book of Enoch provides the contextual foundation for understanding dozens of cryptic references throughout both Old and New Testaments. Without Enoch, passages about the sons of God in Genesis 6, about Tartarus in 2 Peter, about angels bound in chains in Jude, remain incomprehensible. The Ethiopian church never forgot this context. They preserved the full account. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The Book of Enoch contains detailed prophecies about judgment, about the coming Messiah, and about the fate of the watchers who rebelled. According to manuscript analysis, these prophecies were written centuries before the events they describe. Early church fathers knew about Enoch. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, defended the Book of Enoch's authenticity. Clement of Alexandria referenced it. Even Augustine acknowledged its existence, though he questioned its canonicity precisely because it was too old, and its chain of preservation was unclear to him. The real suppression came later, at the church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, when standardization of doctrine became more important than preservation of ancient traditions. What the Ethiopian church understood, and what Western Christianity forgot, is that the Book of Enoch provides the missing narrative link between the creation account and the flood, between the rebellion in heaven and the corruption on earth, between angelic beings and human history. The text describes 7 heavens, each with specific angelic orders. It details the geography of the spiritual realm with the precision of a cartographer. It provides names, hierarchies, and functions of angelic beings that don't appear anywhere else in Scripture. And perhaps most significantly, it reveals that the forbidden knowledge brought by the Watchers wasn't neutral. According to Enoch, this knowledge included warfare, cosmetics designed to enhance seduction, the use of psychoactive plants, astrology used for divination, and metallurgy for weapons. This was knowledge that accelerated human capability before humanity had the wisdom to use it responsibly. The pattern is unmistakable. The texts that were removed from the biblical canon weren't random. They were texts that provided too much detail, too much specificity, too much direct access to spiritual realities without institutional mediation. We are living in times when ancient prophecies are unfolding before our very eyes, yet most people remain in the dark, trapped in incomplete truths that have been carefully concealed from humanity for centuries. Now consider this. What if the very texts that were removed from Scripture contain the answers you've been seeking all along? Answers that can illuminate your path, strengthen your understanding, and reveal the authentic purpose behind the story of Jesus. That's why I've prepared a powerful digital book for you. Why did the apostles hide Jesus' most dangerous words? This isn't just a book. It's a spiritual awakening. A tool for those who desire to go beyond the surface, break free from manipulation, and reconnect with the authentic Christ, without filters, without distortions, without human agendas. Download it now. The link is available in the first pinned comment. But be aware, This content could be removed at any time. It contains spiritually sensitive revelations that make even religious leaders uncomfortable. Don't wait until the world crumbles to seek what your soul already knows it needs. Click now, download your copy, and allow this truth to begin transforming your understanding. And if you're one of the first to download it, come back here and write truth. That will be your act of faith. And perhaps today, a door will open that you never imagined was about to reveal itself. The Book of Jubilees, rewriting sacred timeline. If the Book of Enoch reveals what happened, the Book of Jubilees reveals when it happened. And the chronology it presents fundamentally challenges the timeline you've been taught. According to the Book of Jubilees, preserved as canonical scripture in the Ethiopian Bible, the entire history from creation to Moses is measured in Jubilee periods of 49 years. This isn't just a different calendar, it's a complete reframing of sacred history with precise dates for events that other biblical accounts leave vague. The text, dating according to scholarly analysis to the 2nd century BCE, provides specific information about the patriarchs that doesn't appear in Genesis. It names the wives of Noah's sons. It details the division of the earth among Noah's grandsons. It provides the exact ages when patriarchs received revelations, married, and died. But here's what makes this text controversial. It presents a version of the Torah that claims to have been revealed directly to Moses by angels during his 40 days on Mount Sinai. According to Jubilees, Moses received not just the 10 Commandments, but a complete reinterpretation of human history from creation forward. Dr. James Vanderkam, who has extensively studied Jubilees, notes that this book was clearly considered authoritative by the Qumran community. Fragments of at least 15 different copies of Jubilees were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, making it one of the most frequently copied texts in that library, more common even than many books that made it into the standard biblical canon. So why was it excluded everywhere except Ethiopia? The answer lies in its specific claims about calendar, law, and chronology. The Book of Jubilees advocates for a solar calendar of 364 days, divided into 4 equal seasons of 91 days. This directly contradicted the lunar calendar that became standard in Judaism and later in Christianity, but the theological implications go deeper. According to Jubilees, many of the laws given to Moses were actually eternal principles established at creation itself. The text describes angels observing the Sabbath in heaven before humanity was created. It claims that circumcision was practiced by Abraham according to divine command, written on heavenly tablets. This presentation makes the law pre-existent and cosmic, not situational or historically contingent, and that theological claim threatened the flexibility church authorities wanted in adapting and interpreting religious law. The Book of Jubilees also provides extensive details about angelic beings. It names the angels who taught Noah agriculture. It describes the angel Mastema, who leads evil spirits and who requested that 1/10 of the demons be allowed to remain active on earth even after the flood. It explains that diseases and afflictions come from these remaining spirits, not from divine punishment or natural causes. This detailed angelology and demonology gave believers direct explanations for spiritual warfare without requiring priestly interpretation. You didn't need a religious authority to explain why evil persisted. Jubilees told you directly. According to textual analysis, early Christians widely used Jubilees. The book is quoted or referenced by numerous early Christian writers. Epiphanius of Salamis mentions it. The Apostolic Constitutions reference it. It clearly circulated in early Christian communities. Yet by the 4th century, as the canon was being formalized, Jubilees disappeared from official lists. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE established which books could be read in churches. Jubilees wasn't among them. Only in Ethiopia did this text maintain its sacred status. Ethiopian theologians considered Jubilees essential for understanding the proper calendar, the true chronology of biblical events, and the angelic background to human history. Modern scholars are now recognizing what Ethiopian Christianity preserved. The detailed chronology in Jubilees provides cross-references that help date other ancient events. Its calendar system reveals how ancient Jewish communities actually tracked sacred time. Its angelology explains references throughout both testaments that otherwise seem random. What seemed like dangerous innovation to 4th century church councils was actually ancient tradition, carefully preserved. The pattern becomes clearer. Texts that provided too much detail, too much precision, too much direct access to spiritual knowledge were systematically excluded. The question is, what else did they remove? Have you ever heard about the Book of Jubilees and its alternative sacred timeline? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm fascinated to learn what our community already knows about this. Your insights might illuminate something others haven't considered yet. Banned angels and forbidden names. Here's something that will disturb you. The Ethiopian Bible preserves the actual names of the 200 angels who rebelled, not vague references, not symbolic descriptions. Actual names with meanings, with specific roles, with detailed accounts of exactly what each one taught humanity. This isn't found in any other biblical tradition. It was deliberately removed. According to the Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian canon, these weren't random acts of rebellion. This was an organized conspiracy among celestial beings. The text provides a list in chapter 6. Semjaza, their leader, Arakiba, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijal, Asael, Armaros, Batarel, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Turel, Jomjael, Sariel. Each name has meaning in ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. Semjaza means the name saw. Azazel means God strengthens, or according to some scholars, scapegoat. Kokabiel means star of God. These weren't made-up designations. These were names that conveyed specific functions and attributes. But here's what makes this list spiritually significant. According to the preserved text, each angel taught humanity specific, forbidden knowledge. This wasn't a general corruption. This was a targeted transfer of celestial information to unprepared humans. Dr. Annette Reed of New York University, who has extensively studied the reception of Enochic literature, notes that these names appear in various forms across ancient Jewish mystical texts, suggesting that this tradition of naming rebellious angels was widespread in Second Temple Judaism. The specificity is what made church authorities uncomfortable. When you have names, you can invoke them. When you have detailed descriptions of what each angel taught, you have a roadmap of forbidden knowledge. When you have a hierarchy and organization chart of rebellious celestial beings, you have information that enables spiritual warfare without institutional mediation. The text goes further. According to Enoch chapter 8, Azazel specifically taught humans to make swords of iron and weapons of war. He taught the art of metallurgy not for tools, but for killing. He taught women the art of cosmetics and beautification, which the text presents as tools of seduction. He taught the use of antimony for the eyes, the beautifying of eyelids and precious stones. Semjaza, the leader, taught enchantments and root cutting, what we might call pharmaceutical or herbal knowledge for altering consciousness. Armaros taught the countering of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs and constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds, presumably meteorology or weather manipulation. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth, perhaps geology or seismology. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, likely advanced calendar calculation. This reads like a curriculum, like an organized transfer of celestial knowledge across multiple disciplines. And here's the disturbing part. Archaeological evidence suggests that human civilization did experience sudden leaps in knowledge during the periods these texts describe. Metallurgy appeared rapidly in multiple locations. Advanced astronomical knowledge emerged in ancient cultures without clear developmental progression. Complex mathematical systems appeared seemingly overnight in places like Sumer. The Ethiopian Church preserved these names and this detailed account because they believed it explained historical realities. This wasn't mythology to them. This was the missing piece that explained how human civilization advanced so rapidly. Western Christianity removed these names. The Protestant Reformation went even further, stripping the Bible down to 66 books and eliminating any reference to these angelic beings beyond brief mentions. But in Ethiopian monasteries, monks still study these names. They still examine what each angel taught. They still use this knowledge to understand spiritual warfare and the origins of various forms of human knowledge. The question becomes unavoidable. If this information was preserved as sacred scripture by one of the world's oldest Christian traditions, why was it systematically erased everywhere else? You no longer have to carry this weight alone. Awaken to the forgotten truths with the digital book, Why Did the Apostles Hide Jesus' Most Dangerous Words? The link is in the first pinned comment. Click now and receive your copy before it's taken down. The Ascension of Isaiah, Prophetic Visions Suppressed. Among the most controversial texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon is the Ascension of Isaiah, a text so specific in its prophetic details and so explicit in its description of celestial hierarchies that it was systematically suppressed in other Christian traditions. This isn't a book most believers have heard of. Yet according to textual scholars, it was widely circulated in early Christianity and considered authoritative by multiple church fathers before being excluded from the canon. The text describes the prophet Isaiah's mystical journey through 7 heavens, each ruled by different angelic princes, each revealing deeper layers of spiritual reality. But what made this text particularly dangerous to church authorities was its specific prophecy about Jesus, delivered centuries before his birth, with details that were remarkably precise. According to chapters 10 and 11 of the Ascension of Isaiah, the prophet foresaw not just the coming of a Messiah, but specific details about how he would be born, how he would be rejected by religious authorities, how he would be crucified, and how he would resurrect. The text describes Jesus descending through each of the 7 heavens, disguising himself as an angel of each realm, to pass undetected. Dr. Robert Hall of Hampton Sydney College, who has studied the textual history of this work, notes that portions of the Ascension of Isaiah were clearly circulating by the 1st century CE. Early Christian writers, including Origen and Jerome, reference it, though with varying degrees of acceptance. But here's what makes this text theologically problematic. It presents a cosmology where the God of this world, described as ruling the firmament, is not the ultimate divine authority. The text describes ascending through multiple heavenly realms, each with its own ruler, before reaching the highest heaven where the true God dwells. This multi-layered cosmology suggested that earthly religious authorities were not representing the highest divine power, but rather were subject to the prince of this world, a concept that appears in the New Testament but is never fully developed there. The martyrdom section of the text, which describes Isaiah being sawn in half on orders of King Manasseh, became the basis for the reference in Hebrews 11:37 to prophets who were sawn in two. This shows that early Christians knew and used this text as a historical source, but the visionary sections were too revealing. According to the Ascension of Isaiah, the prophet saw the descent and ascent of the Beloved One, Jesus, through all the heavens. He saw angels worshipping in each realm. He saw the books where human deeds are recorded. He saw the garments of glory that awaited the righteous. Most disturbingly for church authorities, the text suggested that salvation involved ascending through these 7 heavens, gaining knowledge and transformation at each level. This implied a process of spiritual development beyond simple faith, a mystical journey that didn't require priestly mediation. The Ethiopian church preserved this text because it aligned with their understanding of spiritual progression and celestial hierarchy. Ethiopian Orthodox theology has always maintained a rich angelology and a concept of spiritual development through stages. But in the West, as Christianity became institutionalized and doctrine became standardized, texts that suggested direct mystical access to divine realms became problematic. The Church wanted to position itself as the necessary mediator between God and humanity. Texts that described prophets ascending through heavens and receiving direct revelation undermined that institutional authority. Fragments of the Ascension of Isaiah have been found in multiple languages: Greek, Latin, Ethiopic, and Slavonic. This demonstrates how widely distributed this text once was, yet only in Ethiopia did it maintain canonical status. Modern scholars examining this text have found that its descriptions of celestial hierarchies match patterns found in other Second Temple Jewish literature, in Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi, and in early Christian mystical writings. This suggests a widespread tradition of mystical ascent literature that was later suppressed. The prophecies in the Ascension of Isaiah are so specific that some scholars initially dated the text to after Jesus' death, assuming it must have been written retrospectively. However, linguistic analysis and manuscript evidence suggest the core text predates Christianity, with Christian interpolations added later. What the Ethiopian church understood was that this text provided the prophetic foundation for understanding Jesus not just as a moral teacher or sacrifice, but as a cosmic figure who traversed all levels of spiritual reality. The suppression of this text represents a broader pattern, the exclusion of mystical, direct-access spirituality in favor of institutional mediation. If these discoveries are challenging your understanding in profound ways, I invite you to join our exclusive membership community. Here you'll find a fellowship of seekers who, like you, refuse to settle for incomplete truths. Become a member now. The Council of Laodicea and the Great Exclusion. The year 364 CE marks one of the most significant moments in biblical history, yet most believers have never heard of it. This was the year of the Council of Laodicea, a regional church council in Asia Minor that established which books could be read in churches and which books were forbidden. This wasn't a minor administrative decision. This was the systematic exclusion of texts that had been considered sacred for centuries. According to historical records, Canon 59 of the Council of Laodicea provided the first official list of biblical books acceptable for public reading. The list excluded numerous texts that had been widely circulated and used by Christian communities, including many of the books preserved in the Ethiopian canon. Dr. Bruce Metzger of Princeton Theological Seminary, in his comprehensive work on the biblical canon, notes that prior to this council, there was significant diversity in which books different Christian communities considered authoritative. The Council of Laodicea was one of several attempts to standardize doctrine and eliminate diversity. But here's what the historical evidence reveals. The criteria for inclusion weren't purely spiritual or based on apostolic authorship. They were also political and practical. Books that caused theological disputes were excluded. Texts that were used by groups deemed heretical were removed, even if the texts themselves contained valid historical or spiritual content. Works that couldn't be easily controlled or interpreted by church authorities were forbidden. The Ethiopian church, geographically isolated and politically independent from the Roman Empire, was not represented at the Council of Laodicea. They didn't receive these directives. They didn't participate in the debates about which books to exclude. More importantly, they had no political reason to comply. The Ethiopian kingdom had adopted Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana, but maintained its independence from Roman ecclesiastical authority. When Roman councils decided to exclude certain books, Ethiopian bishops continued teaching from their complete collection. According to documented tradition, the Ethiopian church based its canon on the ancient Septuagint tradition, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures produced in the 3rd century BCE. This version included books that were later excluded from the Protestant canon and marked as deuterocanonical in the Catholic tradition. But Ethiopia went further, including texts like Enoch and Jubilees that even the Septuagint tradition had begun to marginalize. The Council of Laodicea wasn't the only canonization event, but it set a pattern. Later councils, including the Council of Carthage in 397 CE and the pronouncements of figures like Athanasius of Alexandria, continued the standardization process. Athanasius's 39th festal letter in 367 CE is particularly significant. In this letter, he listed the 27 books of the New Testament that are now standard, but he also explicitly forbade the reading of other texts that were being used by Christians. His list of forbidden books included many of those preserved in Ethiopia. What's revealing is his reasoning. According to the letter, these other books were apocrypha and inventions of heretics. But by what standard? Many of these texts were older than some of the books he approved. Many were written by the same communities that produced accepted texts. The real issue was control. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine and his successors, standardization became politically necessary. A unified doctrine required a unified scripture. Diverse traditions had to be suppressed. The Ethiopian Church, outside Roman political control and maintaining its own ancient apostolic tradition through Mark's mission to Alexandria and subsequent evangelization of Ethiopia, had no reason to accept this standardization. Archaeological evidence supports Ethiopian claims of ancient Christianity. Excavations at Axum have revealed Christian symbols and structures dating to the 4th century. Manuscript traditions show continuous copying and preservation of texts through the centuries. What looked like rebellion against church authority to Roman bishops was actually preservation of ancient tradition to Ethiopian Christians. The pattern is clear. Texts were excluded not because they were false, but because they were difficult to control, difficult to interpret within emerging orthodoxy, and potentially subversive to institutional authority. You no longer have to carry this weight alone. Awaken to the forgotten truths with the digital book, Why Did the Apostles Hide Jesus' Most Dangerous Words? The link is in the first pinned comment. Click now and receive your copy before it's taken down. The geographic isolation that preserved truth. Sometimes the greatest treasures are preserved not by vaults and guards, but by mountains and distance. The Ethiopian highlands, where Christianity took root in the 4th century, became one of the most geographically isolated Christian civilizations in history. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was providential for the preservation of texts that would have been destroyed elsewhere. According to historical geography, the Ethiopian plateau rises dramatically from surrounding lowlands, creating a natural fortress. Ancient monasteries were built in nearly inaccessible locations, on cliff faces, on isolated peaks, in mountain caves. Some, like Debris Damo Monastery, can only be accessed by climbing a rope up a sheer cliff face. This wasn't just for defensive purposes. This isolation created conditions where ancient traditions could be maintained without outside pressure to conform. Dr. Stephen Kaplan of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has extensively studied Ethiopian Christianity, notes that the Ethiopian Church developed in remarkable isolation from the theological controversies that divided Christianity in the Mediterranean world. While Rome and Constantinople argued about the nature of Christ, while councils declared various positions heretical, Ethiopian Christians continued their ancient practices undisturbed. The conversion of Ethiopia under King Ezana in the 4th century created a Christian kingdom that was politically independent and geographically isolated. Unlike Christians in the Roman Empire, who had to navigate imperial politics and ecclesiastical hierarchies, Ethiopian Christians answered only to their own bishops and their own king. This meant that when Roman councils declared certain texts forbidden, Ethiopian churches never received or never felt obligated to obey those directives. The books they had been reading for generations remained in use. The manuscript tradition confirms this preservation. Ethiopian biblical manuscripts, written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language, show remarkable consistency over centuries. Scholars examining manuscripts from different centuries find the same canonical list, the same books included, the same texts treated as authoritative. The monastic tradition reinforced this preservation. Ethiopian monasticism, which according to tradition was influenced by the Egyptian Desert Fathers through the missionary work of the 9 saints in the 5th century, emphasized copying and preserving sacred texts as a spiritual discipline. Monks would spend their lives meticulously copying biblical books, including those that had been banned elsewhere. These weren't hidden or secret texts. They were openly taught, publicly read, integrated into liturgy and theology. The natural barriers that protected Ethiopia also protected its texts. When Islamic expansion swept across North Africa in the 7th century, cutting Ethiopia off from other Christian communities, these texts survived because they were already safely preserved in highland monasteries. When European explorers and missionaries finally reached Ethiopia in later centuries, they were astonished to find a complete ancient Christian tradition that had developed independently, with a biblical canon larger than anything they knew. The Portuguese mission to Ethiopia in the 16th century documented their surprise at finding texts they considered apocryphal being treated as scripture. Jesuit missionaries attempted to correct Ethiopian practice, leading to resistance and eventual expulsion. This geographical and political independence meant that Ethiopian Christianity preserved not just texts, but entire traditions of interpretation, entire frameworks of theology, entire approaches to spirituality that had vanished elsewhere. The isolation that might have seemed like a disadvantage became the greatest advantage for preserving ancient truth. What if the texts that survived in the most isolated Christian community are the ones that most accurately reflect original Christianity? What if geographical barriers preserved what political power destroyed? The evidence suggests this isn't speculation. It's historical fact. Where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me that these historical revelations are reaching truth seekers across continents. Drop your country or city below. Let's build a global community of investigators. The Book of Giants. Erased mythology. There's a text so disturbing in its implications that it was systematically erased from every biblical tradition except fragmentary remains found in caves. Yet the Ethiopian tradition preserved references and traditions about it that scholars are only now beginning to understand. The Book of Giants is the sequel to the story told in Enoch. While Enoch describes the rebellion of the Watchers and their taking of human wives, the Book of Giants describes what happened to their offspring. According to fragments discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nephilim, the giant offspring of angels and humans, had names, specific names: Oya and Hahya, sons of Semjaza, Mahawai, Gilgamesh. These weren't mythological constructs. The text presents them as historical figures. Dr. Lauren Stukenbrook of the University of Munich, who has analyzed the Qumran fragments of the Book of Giants, notes that this text was considered authoritative by the community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. Multiple copies existed, suggesting it was frequently studied. But here's what makes this text so controversial. It describes these giants as having knowledge beyond human understanding, teaching themselves from the wisdom their angelic fathers had imparted, and ultimately recognizing their own approaching doom. According to the preserved fragments, the giants had dreams and visions warning them of the coming flood. They sought interpretation from Enoch, the one human who had ascended to heaven and returned. The text describes their desperate attempts to understand their fate and their ultimate inability to prevent their destruction. The Ethiopian tradition, while not preserving the Book of Giants as a complete separate text, maintained the narrative tradition about these beings. Ethiopian commentaries on Enoch include details about the giants that match information found in the Qumran fragments. What makes this significant is the global nature of giant myths. Almost every ancient culture has traditions of giants: the Titans of Greek mythology, the Jotun of Norse tradition, the giants mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Nephilim of Genesis, even stories from Native American traditions. The Book of Giants suggested these weren't separate myths. They were cultural memories of the same historical reality, interpreted through different cultural lenses. According to the text, these giants weren't just physically large. They possessed supernatural knowledge. Some fragments suggest they had access to heavenly mysteries through their angelic parentage. They understood secrets of nature that humans shouldn't have known, but they were also corrupt. The text describes them as violent, consuming vast resources, disrupting human civilization, and ultimately turning to cannibalism when other resources were exhausted. The flood narrative suddenly makes more sense in this context. According to the tradition preserved through Enoch and the Book of Giants, the flood wasn't divine anger at human sin in general. It was a necessary reset to eliminate the hybrid population that was corrupting the genetic line of humanity and threatening the entire created order. Dr. Archie Wright of Regent University has pointed out that early Christian writers were familiar with these traditions. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian all reference the story of angels producing giant offspring. This wasn't fringe belief. This was mainstream understanding in early Christianity. So why was it erased? The answer becomes clear when we consider the implications. If angelic beings can materially interact with the physical world, if they can produce offspring, if they can transfer knowledge that accelerates human capability beyond natural development, then the boundary between spiritual and physical reality is far more permeable than institutional theology wanted to admit. This permeability is dangerous to institutional control. If angels can act directly in human affairs, if demonic forces can literally influence genetics and knowledge transfer, if spiritual warfare is material and not just metaphorical, then believers need direct access to spiritual warfare knowledge, not just priestly mediation. The Book of Giants, even in fragments, reveals a worldview where spiritual realities have physical consequences, where cosmic warfare plays out in human history, where the battle between good and evil isn't abstract, but involves specific beings with specific agendas. Ethiopian Christianity maintained this worldview through its preservation of Enochic traditions. They understood that spiritual realities shape physical events, that angelic and demonic forces are active participants in history, that the cosmic story is far larger and more complex than simplified theology admits. The giants were erased from official scripture, but their story remained in the mountains of Ethiopia, preserved by monks who understood that truth is sometimes too big for human institutions to contain. You no longer have to carry this weight alone. Awaken to the forgotten truths with the digital book, Why Did the Apostles Hide Jesus' Most Dangerous Words? The link is in the first pinned comment. Click now and receive your copy before it's taken down. Prophecies too accurate to be allowed. Here's something that will challenge everything you've been taught about biblical prophecy. What if certain texts were excluded from the canon precisely because their prophecies were too accurate, too specific, too verifiable to be safely controlled? The Ethiopian biblical tradition preserves prophetic texts that contain remarkably specific predictions about historical events, cosmic occurrences, and spiritual developments. The precision of these prophecies made religious authorities deeply uncomfortable. Consider the astronomical prophecies in the Book of Enoch. According to chapters 72-82, the astronomical book section, Enoch received detailed information about the movements of celestial bodies, the calendar, the relationship between solar and lunar cycles, and the proper calculation of times and seasons. Dr. James Vanderkam, analyzing these sections, noted that the astronomical observations in Enoch match actual celestial mechanics with remarkable accuracy. This wasn't primitive skywatching. This was sophisticated understanding of planetary motion, seasonal variation, and calendar calculation. But here's what made this dangerous. The text claimed this knowledge came from angels, specifically from Uriel, the angel appointed over the world and over Tartarus. If astronomical knowledge came from angelic revelation rather than human observation and calculation, it suggested that scientific knowledge itself had supernatural origins. This undermined the Church's eventual position that natural philosophy and theology occupied separate spheres. It suggested that all knowledge, including natural science, was ultimately spiritual in origin. The Apocalypse sections of Enoch contain prophecies about kingdoms rising and falling, about periods of oppression and liberation, about the coming of the Messiah. Some of these prophecies are so specific that skeptical scholars initially dated the entire book to after the events it describes, assuming it must have been written retrospectively. However, the discovery of Enochic fragments at Qumran dating to the 2nd century BCE proved that at least portions of the text existed before the events it describes, forcing a reconsideration of how ancient prophecy worked. The Ethiopian tradition also preserved prophetic expectations about the end times that aligned disturbingly well with observable patterns in history. According to their interpretation of these texts, certain signs would mark the approaching conclusion of the age: wars increasing in frequency and intensity, knowledge increasing rapidly, moral corruption spreading, and cosmic signs appearing. Whether you interpret these as genuine prophecy or as pattern recognition doesn't change the historical fact. These texts existed long before the events they described, and those events occurred with remarkable correspondence to the descriptions. But perhaps the most dangerous prophecies were those about religious institutions themselves. Several of the texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon contain warnings about corrupt religious leaders, about institutions that would claim divine authority while pursuing earthly power, about teachers who would mislead the people. The Apocalypse of Peter, while not universally accepted even in Ethiopia, was widely circulated in early Christianity and contained specific warnings about false prophets who would arise within the church itself, leading believers astray through appeals to authority rather than truth. These prophecies became problematic when church institutions consolidated power. How could church authorities claim absolute authority when preserved texts warned about corrupt religious leaders? How could they demand unquestioning obedience when scriptures predicted institutional corruption? The solution was to exclude these prophecies, to remove texts that enabled believers to question authority based on scriptural grounds. Dr. Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina has documented how manuscript traditions show active editing of texts during the early centuries of Christianity. Passages that were theologically problematic were modified or removed. Entire books that couldn't be easily edited were excluded from the canon. The Ethiopian Church, operating independently, maintained texts that preserved these challenging prophecies. They didn't see them as dangerous, they saw them as necessary warnings. The accuracy of the prophecies wasn't the problem. The problem was that they enabled discernment, that they gave believers tools to evaluate religious authority rather than blindly accept it. What if the texts that were excluded weren't removed because they were false, but because they were too true? too revealing, too empowering for ordinary believers. Have you ever felt that prophecies were being hidden from modern believers, that we're not being given the full picture of what was predicted? Share your experience below. Your intuition might be more accurate than you realize. The real reason behind the prohibition. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter. Why were these texts really excluded? What was the actual threat they posed? The answer isn't what you might expect. It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about apostolic authorship. It wasn't even about accuracy or historicity. It was about control. When we examine the pattern of which texts were excluded and which were retained, a clear picture emerges. The texts that made it into the standardized canon were those that could be controlled through interpretation. The texts that were excluded were those that provided direct access to spiritual knowledge without requiring institutional mediation. Let me explain what I mean. The Book of Enoch doesn't say, "Ask your priest about angels." It lists their names, their hierarchies, their functions. It gives you direct access to angelological knowledge. You don't need someone to interpret angelic reality for you. The text tells you explicitly. The Book of Jubilees doesn't say religious authorities will tell you how to calculate sacred time. It provides the calendar system directly. Any literate person could calculate sacred times without consulting ecclesiastical authority. The Ascension of Isaiah doesn't say salvation requires priestly sacraments. It describes Isaiah ascending directly through 7 heavens to encounter God. It presents mystical ascent as available to the spiritually prepared, not as mediated through institutional rituals. This is the pattern. Texts that enabled direct spiritual access were excluded. Texts that required interpretation and mediation were retained. Dr. Elaine Pagels of Princeton University has extensively documented this pattern in early Christianity. In her analysis of why certain texts were labeled Gnostic and excluded while others became orthodox and canonical, she notes that the real dividing line was institutional authority. Texts that supported hierarchical church structure, that emphasized the necessity of bishops and priests, that presented salvation as something dispensed through institutional channels, these texts were preserved and promoted. Texts that suggested direct spiritual knowledge was possible, that emphasized internal spiritual development over external ritual, that gave believers tools for independent spiritual discernment, these texts were suppressed. The Ethiopian church never faced this particular political pressure. They didn't need to consolidate power over a vast empire. They didn't need to standardize doctrine to maintain unity across diverse populations. They were a relatively cohesive kingdom, with ancient traditions that commanded respect, without requiring suppression of alternative voices. So they kept everything. They preserved texts that enabled direct spiritual access, alongside texts that emphasized community and authority. They maintained the balance. But in the Roman world, as Christianity transitioned from persecuted minority to official imperial religion, the needs changed. Constantine and his successors needed religious uniformity to support political unity. The bishops who gained power under this new arrangement needed texts that supported their authority. The councils that determined the biblical canon weren't primarily theological gatherings. They were political events where powerful bishops negotiated which texts would support their vision of church structure and which texts would be forbidden. According to historical records, these councils were often contentious, with bishops arguing passionately for different positions. The outcomes weren't divinely dictated. They were voted on, negotiated, and sometimes imposed by imperial decree. Canon formation was a political process disguised as theological discernment. The texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon represent the path not taken, the Christianity that might have been if political needs hadn't dictated theological decisions. Consider what Christianity would look like if Enoch had remained canonical everywhere. Believers would have detailed knowledge about angelic and demonic hierarchies. They would understand spiritual warfare as literal reality involving named beings with specific characteristics. They wouldn't need exorcists and specialists. They would have the information directly. Consider if Jubilees had remained canonical, believers would calculate their own sacred calendar. They wouldn't be dependent on religious authorities to tell them when to observe holy days. The knowledge would be accessible to anyone who could read. Consider if the mystical ascent texts had remained canonical. Believers would understand salvation as a process of spiritual development and direct encounter with divine reality, not just as institutional membership and sacramental participation. The Christianity that developed in the West after these exclusions was one that necessitated priestly mediation, that required institutional membership, that funneled spiritual access through controllable channels. The Christianity that developed in Ethiopia, preserving these texts, maintained a balance between community authority and direct spiritual access, between tradition and personal mystical experience, between institutional structure and individual spiritual development. The prohibition wasn't about protecting believers from false teaching. It was about protecting institutional power from informed believers. That's the real reason behind the exclusion. That's why these texts were forbidden. And that's why their preservation in Ethiopia matters so profoundly for anyone seeking authentic spiritual knowledge today. The question isn't whether these texts are true. The question is, what were you never supposed to discover? What modern scholars are discovering? Something remarkable is happening in academic biblical studies. After centuries of dismissing the texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon as apocryphal or pseudepigraphical, scholars are now recognizing that these may actually preserve traditions more ancient and more authentic than the standardized texts we've been using. The discoveries began with the Dead Sea Scrolls. When those caves at Qumran yielded their treasures starting in 1947, archaeologists found something unexpected: multiple copies of texts that were only known to survive in the Ethiopian Bible. Dr. James Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary led a comprehensive project documenting and analyzing these parallels. According to his research, the Qumran community, which existed from approximately 150 BCE to 68 CE, considered books like Enoch and Jubilees to be authoritative scripture. These weren't marginal texts, they were core to their theological understanding. This discovery fundamentally changed the scholarly conversation. If a Jewish community in the centuries immediately before and during Jesus' time treated these books as scripture, then their exclusion from later canons can't be justified by claiming they weren't originally considered authoritative. Dr. Michael Stone of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem has spent decades studying the relationship between the Ethiopian biblical tradition and ancient manuscripts found in other locations. According to his analysis, the Ethiopian versions of texts like Enoch preserve readings that are often more original than versions that circulated in Greek or Latin. This makes linguistic sense. The Ethiopian Church translated these texts from ancient languages early in their tradition and then preserved them without the cycles of translation and retranslation that affected texts in the Mediterranean world. Less translation means less corruption. Dr. Lauren Stuckenbrook's work on the Book of Giants has revealed that the Ethiopian narrative traditions about these beings correspond precisely with Aramaic fragments from Qumran that were only identified and translated in recent decades. The Ethiopian Church preserved oral traditions about a text they didn't have completely, and those traditions were validated by archaeological discovery. This suggests remarkably faithful transmission of tradition over nearly 2,000 years. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Richard Bolcom of Cambridge University has analyzed the early Christian use of these texts. According to his research, the New Testament authors were thoroughly familiar with books like Enoch. The Book of Jude quotes it directly. 2 Peter uses similar language and concepts. Jesus' self-designation as Son of Man makes most sense against the background of that title's use in Enoch. What this means is striking. The New Testament was written by authors who considered these texts authoritative. The exclusion of these books from later canons wasn't because the apostles didn't know or value them. It was because later church authorities made different choices than the original apostolic community. Dr. Gabriele Boccaccini of the University of Michigan has proposed that we need to completely rethink how we understand Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. According to his analysis, the Enochic tradition was a major stream of Jewish thought that significantly influenced early Christianity. The texts aren't marginal. They're central to understanding the worldview of Jesus and his earliest followers. Modern linguistic analysis is also revealing surprising things. Dr. George Nicholsberg spent his career analyzing the language and style of texts like Enoch, comparing them with other ancient literature. According to his conclusions, These texts show characteristics of genuine ancient composition, not medieval forgery or late fabrication. Archaeological discoveries continue to support the antiquity of these traditions. Excavations at Qumran, analysis of Ethiopian manuscript traditions, discoveries of related texts in locations from Egypt to the Caucasus all point to the same conclusion. These texts represent ancient, widespread, and influential traditions that were later suppressed. The academic consensus is shifting. What was once dismissed as late Jewish fantasy is now recognized as early Jewish tradition. What was labeled Gnostic innovation is now understood as preservation of ancient Christianity. What was called Ethiopian peculiarity is now seen as maintenance of original apostolic tradition. Universities that once ignored these texts now have specialists devoted to studying them. Academic conferences examine their theology, their influence, their historical context. Major publishers produce critical editions and translations. The Ethiopian Church, it turns out, wasn't wrong to preserve these texts. They were right. And modern scholarship is finally catching up to what Ethiopian Christians have known for centuries. The texts that were excluded from the canon weren't inferior. They were inconvenient. And now finally they're being restored to their rightful place in our understanding of biblical history and Christian origins. Why this matters for your spiritual journey today. So we've journeyed through forbidden texts, suppressed traditions, and excluded books. We've seen how political decisions shaped what you were taught to believe. We've examined evidence that challenges official narratives. But now comes the most important question. What does this mean for you? Here's what you need to understand. This isn't just ancient history. This isn't just academic curiosity. This is about your direct access to spiritual truth. Every text that was excluded from the biblical canon was excluded for a reason. And that reason, as we've seen, wasn't about protecting you from error. It was about controlling your access to knowledge. The Book of Enoch gives you direct knowledge about angelic hierarchies, about spiritual warfare, about the origins of evil. You don't need anyone to interpret these realities for you. The information is explicit. The Book of Jubilees gives you the tools to understand sacred time, cosmic cycles, and the patterns of redemptive history. You don't need religious authorities to calculate these things for you. The knowledge is accessible. The mystical texts give you roadmaps for direct spiritual ascent, for personal encounter with divine reality, for transformation that doesn't require institutional mediation. The path is described explicitly. What the Ethiopian Church preserved, and what modern scholarship is now confirming, is that the earliest Christianity included direct spiritual access, detailed knowledge about spiritual realities, and tools for personal spiritual development. This wasn't hidden from believers. It was taught openly. It was considered essential knowledge. The question is, why are you only discovering this now? The answer is because institutional Christianity needed you not to know. They needed you dependent on their interpretation, their authority, their mediation. Independent believers with direct access to spiritual knowledge and detailed understanding of spiritual realities are much harder to control than believers who are told they need institutional mediation for salvation. But the information survived. It survived in Ethiopian monasteries, in Dead Sea caves, in fragments scattered across the ancient world. And now it's available to you. Understanding these texts doesn't mean rejecting your faith. It means deepening it. It means recovering aspects of original Christianity that were lost when political considerations overrode spiritual authenticity. The Ethiopian Church demonstrates that you can maintain Orthodox Christian faith while including these texts. They've done it for 700 years. They've produced saints, mystics, theologians, and martyrs. Their Christianity is as valid and vital as any tradition on earth. What if the completeness they've maintained is actually closer to original Christianity than the reduced canon you were given? What if the texts that were excluded contain exactly the knowledge you've been seeking? What if your intuition that something was missing from the story you were taught was absolutely correct? The evidence suggests all of this is true. You now have access to information that previous generations could only dream of. The Dead Sea Scrolls are translated and available. The Nag Hammadi texts are accessible. The Ethiopian Bible is available in English translation. Scholarly analyses are published and accessible. You don't need permission to explore these texts. You don't need ecclesiastical approval to discover what was excluded. The information is available. The only question is whether you'll have the courage to examine it. This is your spiritual journey. These are your questions. This is your search for truth. The texts that were forbidden have been preserved. The knowledge that was suppressed has survived. The traditions that were excluded have been maintained, and now you know where to find them. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you continue accepting incomplete information, trusting that authorities know better than you what you need to know, or will you take responsibility for your own spiritual development, exploring the full range of ancient Christian tradition? The Ethiopian Bible isn't a curiosity. It's a key to understanding what Christianity was before political power shaped it into what you were taught. The door is open. The texts are available. The journey awaits. What happens next is entirely up to you. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future revelations. Don't miss the next video where we'll continue uncovering truths that have remained hidden for centuries. And if you truly feel called to go deeper, consider joining as a member. Our community is already accessing research and discussions we can never make fully public. Thanks for watching until the end. I'll see you in the next investigation.